My name is Kyle Sullivan, and I'm just a small town guy at heart. With an associate degree in animal husbandry, my dream was simple: open my own feed store and raise a family. After finishing junior college, I married my high school sweetheart, Kristen. We grew up together, and from as far back as I can remember, she was the only woman I ever imagined sharing my life with. Even after having two boys, Kristen still had that striking beauty, a pretty brunette with a figure that hadn't changed much. I felt proud to call her my wife, and there was nothing I wouldn't do for her. However, Kristen had a desire that I could never fulfill. She yearned for a life far beyond the one I could offer. She followed the glamorous lives of celebrities through magazines and newspapers, always poring over society pages, admiring their luxurious lifestyles. At the dentist's office, while most people read old issues of Reader's Digest, she would dive into automobile magazines, learning all about high-end cars. She knew all the fashion designers and their collections, names I couldn't even pronounce. More than anything, she wanted to be part of that world. But I couldn't give that to her, and I knew it. Eventually, I landed a job in Omaha at a high-end feed store catering to the yuppie crowd. This allowed us to live closer to the city while still keeping me in a line of work I loved. I thrived there, offering personalized service to customers, and the company rewarded me by giving me flexible hours. Kristen seemed happier living in the city than out in the country, at least for a while. When Kristen decided to get a job, we had to put the boys in daycare. They didn't seem to mind, and Kristen took a position with Perkins Medical, a company that made syringes and other medical supplies. It was a typical office job, but it gave her the opportunity to dress up and mix with people who weren't farmers. She liked that. She worked hard, but as her focus shifted to her job, she started to withdraw from our family life. Most of the parenting responsibilities landed on me. I dropped the boys off at daycare, picked them up after work, fed them, and got them ready for bed. I even took over cooking and cleaning, while Kristen made sure her wardrobe was always impeccable. She'd do the laundry, but only her clothes were ironed to perfection. We had been saving money each month so that one day I could open my own feed store. But somehow, even with two incomes, we were no longer able to put any money aside. The cost of daycare ate into some of our funds, but most of it seemed to be spent on Kristen's trips to the beauty salon, expensive clothing, and nail appointments. I couldn't figure out how we were making more, but saving less. Whenever I brought it up, she would get defensive and angry, so after a while I stopped trying to discuss it. Instead, I quietly opened a separate savings account. Then things started to get worse. Kristen began working overtime more frequently, taking phone calls in private, and grew distant in the bedroom. She started talking about wanting a newer car, and even mentioned getting breast implants. It was obvious, my wife was having an affair. I may be a country boy, but I wasn't naive. At that point, I had no interest in saving our marriage. I just wanted to get things sorted out, and move on before it all blew up. I wasn't close with the people she worked with, but if something was going on, I had a strong suspicion it was with someone from her job. I worked with a couple of great guys, Curtis and Martin. They weren't highly educated, but they were hard workers. I was technically their boss, but I never pulled rank. We all knew what needed to get done, and we did it without me having to bark orders. They respected that, and it made for a good working relationship. When I shared what was happening with Kristen, they were more than willing to help with my plan. I'd noticed that every Wednesday, Kristen took extra time getting ready. She always wore her best outfits and fanciest lingerie. It didn't take a genius to figure out that something was going on. I decided to act on a Wednesday. Curtis and Martin agreed to cover my deliveries and appointments so I could take the day off. That morning, I parked near the entrance of the Perkins Medical parking lot. While I waited, I caught up on some technical reading. At around 11 a.m., I spotted Kristen leaving the building. She got into her car, and I followed her. It wasn't difficult. She drove a short distance and pulled into the parking lot of the Sunset Inn. I watched her park at the far west end of the lot, away from the office. Not long after, a man in a red Corvette arrived and parked at the opposite end. I didn't recognize the car, but when he stepped out, Kristen got out of hers. Together, they walked to a ground floor room, number 117, and went inside. He already had the key. My heart sank and a wave of nausea hit me. All I had done was confirm what I already suspected. But now that it was real, I had no idea what my next move should be. Feeling lost and unsure, I decided to drive back to work and let things settle in my mind. But before I left the parking lot, frustration took over. I grabbed my baling wire cutters, got out of the truck, and clipped 2 valve stems on her car, one on the front tire and one on the back. I was angry, though I wasn't sure why I didn't take the same action with his car. The rest of the day dragged by painfully slowly. After work, I picked up the kids, brought them home, and made supper like I always did. When Kristen came in, I casually asked her how her day had gone. She responded with a simple, "Okay," except for mentioning a flat tire. Apparently, one of her co-workers had changed it for her. Nothing more was said about it. The next morning, after dropping the boys off at daycare, I swung by the Perkins Medical parking lot. It didn't take me long to find the red Corvette again, parked in a reserved spot. The sign next to it read, "Ben Gibson, Distribution Manager." That was all I needed. Curtis's wife worked in Perkins' personnel department, and by the afternoon, I had gathered a lot more information about Ben Gibson. He was married, had been for 8 years, to a woman named Erica. He also had a bit of a checkered history, a reprimand for making inappropriate comments to an employee, and some questionable expense account issues. I even got his address, phone numbers, and his social security number, though I wasn't sure what I'd do with all that information. That evening, after a long day's work, Curtis, Martin, and I stopped for a quick beer before I had to pick up the kids. I still wasn't sure what my next step was going to be, but I felt like the pieces were starting to come together. I tried to remain calm and logical, but the anger inside me grew stronger every day. Sometimes, when I was alone, I'd break down into silent tears. I was hurt deeply, and I had no idea how to heal. Living with Kristen was becoming unbearable, and all I wanted was for it to end. I caught a lucky break the next day when I remembered that one of my best customers, Tiffany Perkins, was married to the president of Perkins Medical. Though I'd never met him, Tiffany and I had always gotten along well. When I went to her farm for a delivery, I was extra friendly, trying to figure out if my connection with her could help in any way. While we were talking, her daughter Molly, who was in her final year of vet school, joined us. Tiffany went off to do some barn work, and Molly and I ended up chatting for a good hour. I enjoyed her company, though I felt a brief pang of guilt afterward, but it quickly passed. That weekend, I spent some time in the garage, welding. I crafted a small steel plate about 6 by 6 inches and attached 4 sharp points to it, concrete nails, so they were sturdy and hard. It was my first step toward revenge, a little act of harassment that would start things off. On Tuesday, I saw Tiffany again when I delivered her order. I must have been moping around while unloading because she noticed right away. "Kyle, what's going on? You don't seem yourself today." I hesitated before answering. "I've got some personal problems, Tiffany. Sorry if I'm not in the best mood." She studied me for a moment before offering, "Why don't we grab some coffee? Maybe talking it out will help." We went back to her house, which looked more like something out of a designer magazine than a farmhouse kitchen. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, the kind of place Kristen would have drooled over. Tiffany set the coffee down and leaned in. "So, tell me, how can I help you?" I wasn't sure if I wanted to open up about it, but something told me it might be worth a shot. "Tiffany, it's about Kristen. She works at Perkins Medical, and I suspect she's involved with one of her bosses, but I haven't been able to prove it yet." She raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think that?" "Mostly little things. But last week I saw her with him at the Sunset Inn. She doesn't know I've found out yet, and I don't know how to confront her. I can't tell if she's being manipulated into it, or if she's doing it willingly. It's tearing our family apart. She's barely involved with the kids or me anymore. What's eating me up the most is that she's keeping it all a secret." "Do you know who this guy is?" "I think his name is Ben Gibson. I don't know if they work directly together or in different departments. I've never met him." Tiffany sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. "Do you want me to see if I can help with this?" I hesitated, lowering my head. "If there's a way to deal with this quietly, I'd appreciate it. I don't want to make a big scene." "Okay, let me see what I can do. I'll be in touch when I come back for the oats delivery next Thursday." I thanked her, feeling slightly better. As I stood to leave, I asked, "How's Molly doing?" "She's back at school. She'll be home this weekend, though. You should bring the boys by so she can meet them." I smiled, thinking this might actually work out better than I'd thought. "That sounds great. I'm sure Kristen won't mind me taking the boys out for a while. Could be a good weekend." The next morning, the rain came down hard, soaking everything in sight. Kristen carefully dressed for her usual special day, the same routine as before. I watched in silence, not saying a word. After dropping the kids off at the daycare, I made a quick stop at work. Curtis and Martin were all set to cover for me while I took care of things. Curtis would use my truck to make deliveries and log the entries, and I would initial them later. Martin had borrowed his cousin's van, and we loaded a floor jack into the back of it. My steel plate with its sharp points was attached securely to the jack. Once all the trucks were packed and ready, and after the guys left for their deliveries, I headed for the Sunset Inn. Like clockwork, Kristen arrived and parked in the same spot as last time. Ben, not far behind, pulled into his usual spot too. Once they were inside the room, I waited about 10 minutes to give them time to settle in. In the pouring rain, I wheeled the jack down to Ben's Corvette. Sliding it under the engine block, I jacked the car up just enough. It only took a few seconds before I heard the satisfying pop of the nails piercing the oil pan. After that, I moved to the back and positioned the jack beneath the fuel tank. Another series of pops, and now oil and gasoline were streaming out of the car. I quickly stashed the jack back in the van. The whole process had taken less than a minute. Then, I walked over to Kristen's car and sliced 2 valve stems again, the same as before. My work here was done. As I drove away, I flicked a lit cigarette out of the window, and in the rearview mirror, I saw the flame flare up, followed by an explosion moments later. A surge of satisfaction washed over me as I left the parking lot. That evening, Kristen came home a bit later than usual. She didn't touch her dinner and went straight to bed without a word. After playing with the boys, I bathed them, tucked them in, and settled down to sleep on the couch. The next morning, Kristen didn't get out of bed. I got the boys ready for daycare, made breakfast, and left the house. Still, she said nothing, and I didn't ask. Around 9 a.m., I noticed her car was gone. Back at work, as we finished loading up the trucks, I got a visit from a police lieutenant, Jack Stone. He seemed like a friendly enough guy. "Can you walk me through your schedule from yesterday?" he asked. "Just a normal day of deliveries, nothing out of the ordinary." "Why?" I replied, curious. "Can you account for your whereabouts around noon?" I went to the office and pulled out the delivery logs from the day before, laying them out in front of him. Each stop was listed, with the delivery location, the time, and my initials beside each entry. He glanced at the logs and chuckled slightly. "Pretty thorough. Do you keep these logs every day?" he asked. "If you'd like, I can show you logs from the entire month," I offered, trying to sound casual. He shook his head with a faint smile. "No need, that won't be necessary." I couldn't tell if I should feel relieved or more suspicious. "So, are you going to tell me what this is about?" Stone hesitated but eventually spoke up. "There was a car damaged yesterday at the Sunset Inn in East Omaha. We're trying to gather some information." "Why ask me?" I questioned, my pulse quickening. "Well, there was another car near the damaged vehicle that had 2 valve stems cut. That car belonged to your wife. We're just wondering if it's all a coincidence." I paused, pretending to be confused. "First of all, I have no idea why my wife's car would be in the parking lot of a Sunset Inn. And secondly, what's her connection to the damaged car?" "The car belonged to one of her coworkers. Apparently they had a lunch meeting with some company clients at the hotel. The damage happened while they were inside." "Did you speak to the people they had lunch with?" I asked, testing him. "They couldn't remember their names," he replied, eyeing me closely. "Are you going to level with me, or are we going to play games all day?" He leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. "Do you know a man named Ben Gibson?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I've never met the guy. That's the honest truth." Stone smiled again, more genuinely this time. "I believe you. Look, I don't want to get involved in domestic issues, and I hope I won't have to come back here. Here's my card. If anything else happens, call me first, all right?" He extended his hand, offering a firm shake. "Sorry I had to bring this to your attention. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know, okay?" As he walked away, I called after him, "Thanks, but you didn't really tell me much." By then, I had already started piecing things together in my mind. When the kids and I got home that evening, Kristen's car was in the driveway, and she was casually dressed with supper already prepared. She claimed she hadn't been feeling well and had called in sick to work. She made no mention of the events from the previous day, and I decided not to bring it up either. After dinner, she went to bed early, leaving me to take care of the boys once more. I slept on the couch again. The next morning, she was up and getting ready for work as usual while I got the boys ready for daycare. After I dropped them off, I made a stop at the doctor's office to get tested for STDs, just to be sure. Friday was a routine day at work, and when I got home, Kristen was there again, acting as though nothing was wrong. After supper, I mentioned that I was planning to take the boys to one of my customers' farms for the day. I asked her if she wanted to join us, though I fully expected her to decline, which she did. She said she had some shopping to do, and I didn't bother pushing it further. Whether it was actually shopping or a date, the outcome was the same. That Saturday, we had a great time at the Perkins Ranch. Molly, the boys, and I spent the whole day having fun, and Tiffany put together a fantastic lunch for everyone. Molly seemed to adore the boys, and they took to her quickly as well. Mr. Perkins wasn't around, so I still didn't get a chance to meet him, and Tiffany didn't bring up our previous conversation, nor did Molly seem aware of it. I didn't want the day to end, but eventually we had to head home. When we got back, Kristen didn't even ask how our day had been. It was clear she just didn't care. The boys, eager to share their adventures, tried telling her about all the things they had done, but she was completely disinterested. After a few failed attempts, they gave up. She did, however, ask why I had been sleeping on the couch. I told her that work had been stressful, and I didn't want my tossing and turning to disturb her sleep. That was the last she mentioned it. The following week went by without incident. On Kristen's typical special day, she didn't make any of her usual preparations, so I assumed her plans had been canceled, which was fine by me since I had a lot of work to catch up on. I made an appointment with a divorce lawyer I'd heard about, and she gave me a stack of brochures and fill-in-the-blank forms that looked promising. Everything seemed back to normal until the next Wednesday. That morning, Kristen started off with a long shower, carefully styled her hair, and slipped into brand new black lingerie. She even wore a new perfume and had a fresh pair of shoes. I was careful not to let her catch me watching, but it was obvious today was going to be another date day. After dropping the boys off, I swung by Perkins Medical to check the parking lot. Sure enough, a new Porsche Boxster was sitting in Ben's reserved spot. I jotted down the license plate number and hurried back to work. The guys were just as excited as I was about this new development, and we rushed through all the morning deliveries, tweaking the logs again like we had before. I had a feeling Lieutenant Jack Stone could probably see through our ruse, but we did it anyway. This gave us plenty of time for an extended lunch. Curtis continued making deliveries while Martin swung by a pool supply store and picked up 2 big bottles of hydrochloric acid. Meanwhile, I decided to pay a visit to Jack Stone. I walked into his office with 2 pulled pork sandwiches, fries, and a couple of Cokes. Jack gave me a strange look, sensing something was up, but couldn't help smiling as I sat down across from him. "I thought we could have lunch together," I said, setting the food on his desk. "Maybe you could fill me in on that car damage case." My goal was to keep him occupied for a solid 2 hours. While I made small talk and pretended to enjoy lunch, Martin was down at the Sunset Inn parking lot. He had found the Porsche and went to work, carefully pouring the acid over the car's trunk, fenders, and deck. Next, he sliced open the convertible top and doused the leather seats and floor mats with the remaining acid, making sure to hit the dashboard too. Then, for good measure, he dropped a box of mothballs into the gas tank. The naphtha would destroy the engine if anyone tried to start it. He used the leftover acid to coat the tops of the tires. Before leaving, Martin snipped the valve stems on Kristen's car once more. The whole thing was done in under 15 minutes. The only downside was not knowing how long Ben and Kristen would stay in that room. Jack and I passed the time chatting about small talk, but eventually he gave me a curious look and asked, "What the hell are you up to?" "Just making sure I've got a solid alibi in case something happens to Ben Gibson's car today," I replied, keeping my tone light. "What's so special about today?" he asked, playing along. "The pulled pork sandwich was on special," I said with a smirk. I pulled out my phone and dialed the daycare. "Hi, Melanie, it's Kyle Sullivan. I'm going to be tied up this afternoon and was hoping you could call Kristen and ask her to pick up the boys. You can reach her at 864, 3254, extension 117. You may need to ask for her by name. Could you call soon? Thanks a lot." Jack chuckled and leaned back in his chair. Those pork sandwiches were really something. We sat in silence for a while, but then Jack spoke up again. "You think I should give Mr. Gibson a call? Check on his car?" "Why would you want to do that?" I asked. "Do you happen to know where I could reach him?" Jack was still smiling, but I could tell he was waiting for me to play my next card. I casually gave him Ben's cell number and the number for room 117 at the Sunset Inn. "Take your pick." Jack put his phone on speaker and called the hotel. After a few rings, Ben answered, his voice heavy with labored breathing. Hello? Who's this? Mr. Gibson, this is Detective Stone. Just calling to let you know we still don't have any leads on who damaged your car. How did you get this number? Why are you calling here? I'm a detective, Mr. Gibson. By the way, did you get a new car yet? Yes, I did. Why do you care? Just wanted to make sure we don't have a repeat of the last incident. Is the car with you now? Yes, it's parked outside. Why? Is it all right? Let me check, Ben grumbled. We could hear the rustling and mumbling as he peered through the window. Then came a low moan, followed by a hesitant voice. Something's not right. I'll have to get dressed and go check. I'll call you back. But Mr. Gibson, why aren't you dressed right now? Jack asked, teasing him. None of your damn business, Ben snapped. I've got to go. With that, they both hung up. Jack turned to me with a grin. Satisfied? Absolutely, I said, feeling a small surge of triumph. I've got to get back to work. But if you need anything, you know where to find me. Maybe we'll have lunch again next week. I hope not. This needs to end soon before someone gets hurt. I headed back to work, where Curtis had the logs looking pristine, and Martin had disposed of the acid bottles where no one would ever find them. That evening, Kristen picked up the boys, but said nothing, once again heading straight to bed without a word. The next day, Jack came by to give me the rundown on the damage to Ben's Porsche. It was completely totaled, and to make matters worse for Ben, his insurance company refused to cover the claim, citing the previous incident with his Corvette. He was out over $60,000. Ben insisted that I was somehow involved, even though Jack had already told him I was with him at the time. Of course, Jack knew I had a hand in it, but he couldn't prove a thing. And honestly, I didn't think he even wanted to. Meanwhile, I had no idea how Kristen was getting her tires fixed. I never asked, and she never brought it up. But since she hadn't come clean about her affair, I decided it was time to bring everything to a close. My STD test came back clean, and I had filled out all the paperwork to get the divorce process started. I was planning on spending the weekend at the Perkins' ranch again with the boys, hoping Molly would be there. If not, we'd still enjoy the day with Tiffany. The weekend was a breath of fresh air. Molly was there, and the boys were overjoyed to see her. We spent the day together, like a real family. I realized how much I missed that, and so did the kids. Molly was oblivious to what had been going on with Kristen, but I appreciated that she didn't pry. As we were leaving, Tiffany gave me a wink and said, "Don't worry, everything will be okay." I had recently been offered a new position about 100 miles away. It came with more pay, better benefits, and even the option to buy into the business after a few years. It was perfect, except for one thing. It would take me far from Molly. By the next Wednesday, Kristen was back to her usual routine, dressing up in her best clothes, complete with new lingerie and perfume. I didn't know what car Ben was using now, but I knew she was getting ready to meet him again. They were likely headed to the same place as before. I hadn't planned ahead, but I knew I had to do something. The guys and I were brainstorming ideas when Tiffany Perkins suddenly pulled up. She motioned for me to hop in the car, and without saying a word, drove me straight to the plant. We entered through a private back door, and Tiffany led me directly to Mr. Perkins' office. After some brief introductions, his secretary brought in coffee, and we made small talk for a while. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer and asked, "Did you bring me here for a reason?" Mr. Perkins chuckled. "It's time to bring this saga to a close. Tiffany has filled me in, and I've had a little investigation done within the company. By the end of the day, we'll have everything you need. I want to make sure nothing I do embarrasses you, Kyle, and I apologize in advance if anything does. It's not my intention to hurt you." We continued chatting to pass the time, and I couldn't help but smile when the conversation drifted toward Molly. Tiffany noticed, but didn't say anything, though it was clear I wasn't doing a great job of hiding my interest. Suddenly the phone rang, and everyone went silent, listening intently. Mr. Perkins answered, "What's going on? All right, thanks for the call. You know what to do now, right?" He hung up and smiled at me. "Everything is set. Ben and your wife are in their usual room at the Sunset Inn. Ben took a company van to get there, which is against policy. The van's already being driven back to the plant. Oh, and it looks like your wife has a couple of flat tires again. Seems to be a tradition at this point." He placed the phone on speaker and dialed the room. "Ben, this is Mr. Perkins. Sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss something important." Ben's voice came through, a bit panicked. Yes, Mr. Perkins, no problem. How did you get this number?" "That's not important right now, Ben. What matters is that the legal department has been alerted about a potential sexual harassment issue. I need some clear answers from you, so listen carefully. Is there a female company employee with you right now?" There was some muffled conversation in the background before Ben responded. "Yes, sir, there is." "Good. Now, is she there of her own free will, or was there any coercion or threats from your side?" Ben stammered. "No, sir. Absolutely no coercion. She's here of her own free will." "So, the sex between the two of you is consensual then?" "Yes, sir. It's all consensual." "Great, Ben. That's all I needed to clear up the situation. I appreciate your honesty. We'll get a statement drafted and you can sign it when you get back to the plant. But first, I need to verify this with the young lady. Can you put her on the line, please?" There was more rustling before Kristen came on the phone. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "Kristen, did Mr. Gibson coerce or threaten you in any way to come here?" "No, sir. He didn't threaten me at all." "All right. So the sex was consensual, and you weren't pressured or intimidated in any way. Is that correct?" There was a pause and some faint talking in the background. Then Kristen's voice returned. "Yes, sir. It was consensual." "Good to hear. When you both get back to the plant, the statements will be ready for you to sign. Can you put Ben back on the line, please?" Before handing the phone back, Kristen asked, "How did you know my name?" "Don't worry about it, Kristen," Mr. Perkins replied calmly. "That's not important right now." Ben came back on, and Mr. Perkins instructed him to return to the plant to sign the necessary paperwork with the legal department. After hanging up, he turned to me with a grin. "Tiffany, why don't you take Kyle out for lunch? By the time you return, everything should be wrapped up, and we can all move on." We headed out for a great lunch. I couldn't stop thanking Tiffany for everything, but she eventually made me promise never to talk about it again. She also made me swear not to mention any of this to Molly, which I took as a good sign. Over lunch, I told her about my new job offer, and she was genuinely happy for me and the boys. After lunch, we returned to the plant. I collected notarized copies of the statements Ben and Kristen had signed, both of them admitting to having consensual sex outside their marriages. The legal team assured me this was all the evidence I needed for the divorce. Ben and Kristen were both fired on the spot, and their personal belongings had already been packed up before they arrived. They were escorted out of the building, but neither had a car waiting for them. Tiffany graciously lent me her car and told me to return it the next day. I immediately dropped off the papers at my lawyer's office. She made several copies and suggested I send one to Ben's wife. From there, I headed to the bank where I closed all the joint accounts, paid off the credit cards, and canceled them. Then I contacted the utility companies, gas, water, electric, and phone, to arrange for everything to be shut off by Friday afternoon. I also stopped by to see Jack Stone, letting him know I'd been behaving. He laughed, but he knew what had gone down. Finally, I informed my landlord that I wouldn't be staying the next month and gave my notice at work. The team was happy for me, though sad to see me go. Martin followed me out to the Perkins Ranch in my truck so I could return Tiffany's car. It was time to pick up the boys and head back home, though I dreaded walking through that door. When we arrived, Kristen's car wasn't in the driveway. Inside, though, she was sitting on the couch, crying, something I hadn't seen her do through this whole ordeal. 2 file boxes sat next to her, filled with her personal belongings from work. I quietly fed the boys and turned on the TV for them, standing near Kristen, giving her the chance to speak if she wanted to. After a moment, she looked up, her voice sharp with anger. "You just had to do it, didn't you? You just had to ruin everything in my life. Why couldn't you mind your own damn business? You had no right to meddle in mine." I stood there astonished at how she still viewed the entire situation as if it revolved around her alone. Not a single thought was given to the kids, to me, or even to Ben's wife, Erica. Our family, our life together, and all the plans we had built meant nothing to her. Her only concern was her own desires. In that moment, I realized how relieved I was that I wouldn't be spending the rest of my life with her. I didn't say a word. Instead, I went upstairs, took a shower, and later, as I got the boys ready for bed, Kristen quietly slipped into the bedroom and shut the door behind her. The next day, I took the boys to work with me. I made sure everything was squared away, ensuring Curtis and Martin could manage the system I had set up. Afterward, we went around town, collecting boxes for the move. I drove by the Sunset Inn, and Kristen's car was gone, so I assumed she had finally gotten it fixed. Those flat tires must have taken a toll on her shopping budget lately. When we got back home, Kristen was nowhere to be found. I packed up only clothes and toys, leaving everything else for her to deal with. Of course, she had no idea the utilities were being shut off the next day. As we were pulling out of the driveway, Kristen arrived. She stood by her car and watched us drive away, saying nothing. That night, I took the boys to Chuck E. Cheese's, and we spent the night at a motel. The next morning, I dropped the boys off at daycare for the last time. I handed Melanie some cookies and party favors and told her to let the boys enjoy their final day with their friends. Before I left, Melanie pulled me aside. "Kyle, what was the deal with your wife last week? I didn't want to pry, but since you're leaving, I've been dying to know." She was so upset when I called her, demanding to know how I got the number. When I told her you gave it to me, she cursed like a sailor. She didn't say much when she picked up the boys, but I could tell she was furious. I sighed, feeling a bit guilty. "Melanie, I owe you an apology. I kind of set you up." Kristen was having an affair, and she was at the Sunset Inn with her boyfriend. I figured if you called and interrupted them, maybe she'd rethink the whole thing. It didn't work. She just got mad at both of us. I'm serving her with divorce papers this afternoon, and after I pick up the boys, we're moving on to a new life. I'm sorry for pulling you into it. After leaving daycare, I met with my divorce lawyer. Everything was ready to go. I was getting full custody of the kids, and Kristen had visitation rights whenever she wanted, though I doubted she'd be interested. Everything else was divided equally, though there wasn't much to split. No alimony, no child support, no cash settlements. I left her all the furniture, appliances, and household items. I didn't want them. She kept her car, which I didn't want either, considering its habit of getting flat tires. All I had to do now was hand her the divorce papers. If she didn't contest, it would all be final in 3 months. Attached to the papers was a notarized copy of Ben and Kristen's statement, where they both admitted to having consensual sex outside their marriages. My lawyer had noted that the statements would be kept private if Kristen agreed to the terms without any issues. I pulled up to the house, sitting in the driveway for a long time. I had loved Kristen. She was the only woman I had ever been close to, and I believed our relationship was normal. I never considered that I wasn't giving her what she needed or craved. She never said anything outright, and I had been too blind to pick up on the subtle hints. Yes, her actions were deceitful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my own inattention had played a part in driving her away. Finally, I got out and knocked on the door, my own front door. It felt strange. Kristen answered, looking tired and worn out. She asked if I wanted a drink, but I didn't respond. Instead, I handed her the divorce papers. She didn't open them, just stared at them before looking back at me. I couldn't tell if she was angry or sad. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "He smelled like aftershave, and you always smelled like fertilizer. He wore Armani suits while you stuck with jeans. He ate lobster and steaks, and you settled for ribs and burgers. He had a London fog coat, and you wore Carhartt. He drove a fancy car, and you were always in your truck. His nails were manicured, and yours were perpetually dirty. He had a real job, and you're just a farm boy. Is that enough, or should I keep going?" Kristen's words were cold and sharp. "I wanted a life you just couldn't give me. I'm sorry we got married, Kyle. I did it for all the wrong reasons. I saw you as a way to escape my parents, but I didn't think ahead. I really am sorry for that." She paused, and the sting of her next words hit me harder. "I love our children, but I regret having them. I know that sounds awful, but I don't have a motherly instinct. I thought that finding someone to fill the emptiness in my life would help, but it only made me more dissatisfied with what I had. I misled you, and I'm sorry for that. I wasn't a good mother, but I'm not sorry for chasing after my dreams and looking for something better." I couldn't stay silent anymore. "What about his wife? What about your husband? What about our kids? Our family?" Her demeanor shifted instantly. My question sparked anger in her, and the regret in her voice vanished. "I don't care about any of that," she snapped. "It's my turn now. I want to live the life I've always dreamed of, and a farm boy husband with 2 dirty, snot-nosed kids isn't going to help me get there. I've got your papers. Now leave so I can move on with my life." Her words made things easy. I turned and walked out, not looking back. Later, when I picked up the boys from daycare, Melanie offered her help if I needed her to make any more calls. Before leaving town, I called the utility companies and asked them to keep the services on until the end of the month. I guess, in some small way, I still felt a twinge of sympathy for Kristen. The divorce was finalized in 3 months. Kristen never reached out again. My lawyer said the whole process went as smoothly as expected. The new job was going well, though I missed out on buying the business I had been eyeing. Someone else snatched it up. along with a prime quarter section of land. They were turning it into a horse breeding farm, I later learned. My job was safe, but my dream of owning my own place had hit a snag. A couple of weeks after, construction began next to the feed store. We were all curious about what was being built, so one of the guys finally asked the site engineer. It turned out to be a large animal vet clinic. I found it interesting, but didn't think much more about it. The building went up fast, and within 60 days, it was complete. The new owner was set to arrive on Saturday. On our way to lunch, the boys and I passed by the clinic, and there she was, looking as amazing as ever, with Tiffany by her side. Molly had finished her vet degree and was planning to raise show horses while running the large animal clinic. She gave the boys a tour of the new facility while Tiffany and I chatted. We all went to lunch afterward, and Molly mentioned that she was also building a house on the property so she could live close to her work. The boys and I were grinning from ear to ear all the way home. 5 years later, Molly's horse business was flourishing, and her clinic had become a huge success. I had opened my 6th feed store by then, and the boys now had 2 baby sisters they adored. Every weekend, Tiffany and Mr. Perkins came to visit, though I never did learn his first name. Kristen never visited the boys.